thank you very much for coming tonight. Great turnout. Just one housekeeping thing. All of you who are here because I told you I'd pay you $20. That was a joke. Okay, I hope you have a good sense of humor. You know who you are. No, thanks a lot. I'm going to keep it really brief tonight. I have a lot of people to thank. I'm going to read very briefly from this, and then Kurt and I are going to get together and talk about it. When you write a book like this one, Gunflint Burning, it's a real village project. A lot of people are involved, and you have a lot of people to thank. Before I get into thanking those people, though, I have to thank Magers and Quinn. This is one of the best bookstores in the Twin Cities. I love these guys. Today is actually the release date for this. This book has been out for a while, but it's the release date, and I knew when it came out I wanted to do it in the Twin Cities somewhere, and so I reached out to Magers and Quinn, you know, thinking that this is typically one of the coldest days of the year. So all of you who signed up early, I've got your names. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, because we were blessed with the January thaw, so, you know, thanks a lot to Magers and Quinn. These guys are great. They do this every month. This is one event. They have several every month, and they're all worth checking out. So check out their website, and definitely patronize them. If you don't buy my book, if you don't buy Kurt's book, shame on you. But there's lots of great books here to choose from. We want to patronize these guys. Minnesota is great for a reading culture and a writing culture. We support our writers, and we do it through our independent bookstores. Thank you very much. Probably first and foremost, the person that I need to thank. This is a village project. I need to thank the village chief, which is my wife. No one heard more stories about the writing of this book, heard more ups and downs about the writing of this book. She's a counselor. She had to counsel me many times throughout the writing of this book. I really appreciate it. On the way over in the car, she turned to me and said, you know, tonight I have 3 pieces of advice for you. Keep it short. And you know, when your wife says something like that in the car, you have to pay attention, or it could be a quiet ride home. You have to keep it short. Don't talk about religion, and don't talk about politics. And I thought, what am I going to talk about? The book. So I'm definitely going to keep it brief. I'm going to follow those suggestions, keep it brief, and then, as I mentioned, I'm going to read briefly from the prologue and then open it up for questions. So just anything goes, whatever questions you have for me or Kurt or writing practices, let us know. The other thing I need to thank people for are the people who participated in this book. I probably interviewed 100 people in the writing of this book. I call out about 60 in the acknowledgments. I really appreciate them. Without their, participation and sharing their stories, I don't think anyone was in the blowdown who was not sort of transformed by that event. It was really traumatic for a lot of people. And these people were really helpful in sharing their stories and giving them to me so I could write about them in this particular book. I also want to thank novelist Kurt Johnson, who's here with me tonight. One of my favorite books last year that I read was The Barrens, the book he co-wrote with his daughter Ellie about being up north. An excellent book. I didn't know Kurt before I read The Barrens, and I sent him an email and told him how much I appreciated the book, and we got to corresponding, and then out of the blue I said, hey, I got this thing you can maybe help me with on the coldest day of the year. And he graciously agreed to come, so I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to read again briefly, this is probably less than 5 minutes, from the prologue, and then Kurt and I will open it up for questions. from the start of the prologue. Since the still, hot start to the day, Jen Nagel had sensed foreboding. After the late morning Sunday service, some of the attendees had lingered, sitting on the edge of the open-air chapel, seemingly overcome by the heat and humidity. Warm weather wasn't unusual for July in the Boundary Waters, but Jen couldn't recall this kind of heat, compounded by the air's moisture, and it was strangely calm, as though the entire area were enclosed in a bell jar. Between the end of the service and 1 o'clock lunch, Jen decided to return to her cabin and change clothes. Then I go on and describe Jen and give her background and talk a little bit about the Wilderness Canoe Base, which is a at the time in 1999, it was a Lutheran-based camp. At the end of the Gunflint Trail, it was sat on 2 islands, Fishhook and Dominion Islands. Fishhook, half of Fishhook Island, was actually in the Boundary Waters. That's how close the WCB is to the Boundary Waters. And the last page and a half. Contrary to WCB recommendations, Jen had worn sandals to the late morning service. But on her return to her cabin, she felt more keenly the strange intensity in the air. The feeling caused her to slip into her hiking boots, careful to lace them tight. By the time Jen climbed the hill to Pine Cliff, what she saw to the west unnerved her. Having grown up in southern Minnesota, she was familiar with tornado season, and the wall of green clouds reminded her of the antecedent to Twisters back home. As if responding to her thoughts, the day's vacuum-like stillness was broken by a slight breeze. Others were gathering for lunch. Typically, Sundays at the base were transition days. One set of week-long campers would have left the previous day, and a new crop of visitors would be arriving throughout Sunday. But today was a holiday, and unusually, most of the people at the base were employees, guide counselors, base support staff, and a handful of leaders like Jen. The WCB attracted a young, creative, and adventurous crowd. The community had a tradition of celebrating the 4th of July with playful costumes, games of greased watermelon, and a cookout on the beach, followed by a paddle-in movie. The group loved to have fun, and all the preparations were underway for another great Independence Day celebration. Now everyone who had remained in camp gathered on the western side of Pine Cliff to watch the weather come in. As the wall of green clouds approached, the breeze began pushing the trees. The rain came on, and there was another uptick in the wind. WCB employees were familiar with being exposed to inclement weather. Many of them loved to experience meteorological histrionics firsthand. Now several of them stepped out on the western-facing deck and began dancing in the downpour. Not long after the rain began, Jen thought she saw lightning approaching with the intensifying weather. The trees began to sway more wildly, and for fear someone was going to get hurt, she called out to the revelers to return to the safety of Pine Cliff's interior. Finally, the gathering storm forced everyone inside. Amazingly, the wind intensified. As Jen and the others peered through the blurry rainfall, they could feel as much as see the mounting torrent. The forest was battered by the oncoming storm. And then a phenomenon happened that shocked everyone who saw it. The massive trees of the surrounding forest began to lift and settle, as if some kind of seismic wave were sweeping toward them. Jen had attended enough naturalist lectures to know the forest of the Boundary Waters had shallow roots. The area was rocky, and the soil in many places was only inches deep. In consequence, the towering red and white pine's root systems spread out beneath them, some growing wider than their canopies. Under the soil, many of the trees' root systems were interconnected. Now the tops of Dominion's old trees intensified their sway. Jen and the others watched in amazement as the carpet of huge intertwined trees were being lifted up out of the ground and set back down, as Jen recalled. So as each of the trees were moving, it made the land look like it was breathing. but they were still standing. It was so strange. Maybe if the wind had blown at 80 miles per hour instead of 100 or 120, the trees would have continued to rise and return to the ground as though the earth were exhaling. But instead, it loosened and pulled up big chunks, and as those trees went over, they knocked over other trees because they're all interlaced. The undulation was making the giant pines bend and weave and rise and drop like shocks of wheat succumbing to the sweep of a giant invisible hand. Then everyone felt an even stronger blast of wind, and the huge trees on Fishhook and nearby Dominion and 3 Mile Island and all over the heart of the Boundary Waters began to fall. So thanks again for coming, and now we can open it up for some questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll start with one here. When I was writing the Barrens, I had a first draft and I gave it to a friend of my daughter who's a counselor at Camp Widgewater. And she had to drop the book after about 50 pages because it brought up a lot of bad trauma and kind of PTSD symptoms from when she almost lost a camper on a trip in Canada. So tell us about talking to some of these people, and you must have come across some of the same things.
Yeah, I definitely did. Some people, most people were really good in sharing their stories and telling these traumatic stories about them. Some people you could tell, like one of the women I track in the book is Lisa Nass. She isn't here tonight, is she? A lot of these people I've never met. I've just talked to them and emailed them and that kind of thing. Lisa, you could tell when I interviewed her, it had been a really traumatic event. She almost died. And so she, even though that happened to her, she told me her whole story, and so did the people that she was with. That's how I was able to write it. And I really appreciated that. But other people, I call this Gunflint Falling. Really, a lot of the story happened off the end of the Gunflint, at the end, but the last 20 miles of the Gunflint is 57 miles long. Most of the last 20 miles was where the storm struck the part of the Gunflint, and way far to the east, all the way over to Ely. So there was. I'm sorry. Yeah, Ely to the west. Yes, to the west. And there was one. So because I was calling it Gunflint Falling, there was a story of a guy that was off of, he was at Hungry Jack, the turnoff to Hungry Jack Lake, and he almost died. And I tried to get a hold of him and and he just never responded. And I think he was one of those guys that just didn't want to revisit it. It was just too.
How did you find 100 people to even talk to about this sort of thing?
Well,
it's been a few years since the blowdown.
It has, yeah, and not all of them are still alive. There was a book that was self-published 2 years after the blowdown in 2001. It was called Our Wounded Wilderness. And it was really a compendium, an 8.5 by 11 compendium of articles from local papers and that sort of thing. And I found lots of the names of people to interview in that book. And then it was just trying to do the research to find them.
Sure.
But anytime I'd find, like Lisa Nass, she actually got married, and so I couldn't find her. But the Schwendingers, a couple, were with her at the time, and I was able to find them. So it was like a network. You'd talk to one person and they'd recommend
find another person.
Yeah.
I had something that was curious to me because I was on an island in Burnside Lake in Ely when the storm hit, and Ellie was 1 year old, and my wife was there, and it was scary. It was a scary experience. We saw it coming, and it was scary. I won't go into the whole thing, but it kind of came through and destroyed a bunch of trees, and then they started up the parade in Ely at 2 o'clock. And I think the storm hit at 1 o'clock. So by 2 o'clock, we were watching the parade and the clown band up in Ely. But at any rate, that was the first, I grew up going to Ely, since I was 10 years old. That was the first straight line winds I'd ever seen or knew about. We had tornadoes before, that was straight line winds. And since then, like in the last 15 years, we've had a bad storm come through every 1 or 2 years. And we've lost lots of trees. The Burnside Lodge was almost destroyed in one storm. They lost a 10-stall boathouse that went flying up and crashed into all these cars and tons of trees. And I haven't seen any tornadoes, but just wondering, is this book have anything to do with climate change and straight winds up there? Because, like I said, I never saw them before the blowdown.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I do try to bring in climate change into the book a little bit. And I really think about this book as one of the first, as a depiction of one of the first salvos fired in the whole climate change thing. A lot of people start climate change from around 1988 when the head, I think his name was Dr. Jennings, he was the head of the NASA Space Institute, and he was testifying at a Senate hearing in Washington about this greenhouse gas effect and saying it was going to impact our weather moving forward. Now that was in 1988. This happened in 1999, 11 years later, and that was 25 years ago. So I really think this storm and this book sort of depicts one of those early severe weather events. And in fact, a lot of people don't know this, but the storm that hit you and Burnside Lake and hit Ely, it did hit Ely. They just postponed their parade. It didn't hit them as bad.
Right.
It's kind of skipped along until it hit the western edge of the Boundary Waters, and then it just flattened everything. That storm started in northwestern Minnesota and in the Ely area and headed east, and it continued. It was actually a 6,000-mile storm that spanned 4 or 5 days. It went 1,000 miles east-northeast out of the Boundary Waters. The Boundary Waters was where it did its most significant and intense damage, but it was bad going east. It actually killed a few people in southern Canada, and then into the northeastern U.S., and it hit the eastern seaboard, turned abruptly south until it got to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, turned inland and tore through the south, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Mississippi Delta, until it finally went into the Gulf of Mexico and burned itself out. So it was a significant weather event, and it was one of those that Dr. Jennings was starting to talk about.
Sure.
And it was also unusual because, to what you were saying, straight line winds, derechos don't usually happen at that latitude. But that's something that we're probably going to see more and more of as time goes on, unless we can do something to sort of mitigate the rising temperatures.
Right, right. The big story after the blowdown was that the whole Boundary Waters was going to burn. Talk about that a little bit, and I think you wrote another book about it.
Yeah. In fact, Gunflint Burning, talking to all those people was really what got me into this book, because they all said, well, that fire burned so intensely because of the blowdown that happened on July. And it wasn't only that fire. The Cavity Lake fire of 2006 burned a lot of that fuel. The Pagami Creek fire of 2011, it burned a lot of that fuel. There's still fuel up there. In the first 3 or 4 years after the blowdown, they were unseasonably wet years in the Boundary Waters. If you went up there in that time period, you would probably hit rain, it was overcast, it wasn't conducive to fires, and that's why we didn't really see anything until like 5 or 6 years later. But yeah, there's still a lot of fuel up there to burn.
Yeah, and going off topic, they're just the balsams that are everywhere, and they're like gasoline, if you put an imagine underneath them. But moving on to craft a little bit. So you write both fiction and nonfiction. Personally, I just write fiction because I don't have to talk to anybody else, and I don't have to answer to any hard facts. Talk about that. Talk about writing both fiction and nonfiction, and how does that mix work for you?
Well, I write fiction. I write nonfiction a lot like I write fiction, except you have to hone to the details, what people are going to tell you. But I interview people, and particularly if I find a really dramatic story, I write it up. I will actually, not all journalists do this or recommend it, but I'll actually share it with the people just to make sure I've described it accurately, I'm quoting them correctly, that kind of thing, and I'm getting the story correct. So, but I still think I try to anyway, all the devices that you use in fiction writing, the description of areas and all that kind of thing that you do in nonfiction.
Sure.
I have to say, your descriptions in the Barrens was one of the things that I just loved. I mean, had you been to the Barrens? Is this place up on the Canadian Shield, right?
Yeah, we have somebody that's been up there quite a few times.
Tundra.
Yeah, Tundra. Well, that's why it's covered by my daughter, because she was up there with Camp Widgewagon, and she was on a 50-day canoe trip through the barren lands of subarctic Canada. And the river goes for about 500 miles, and she canoed it with 3 other women. And I was fascinated by the trip. And I called her up, she was back at college, and I said, I've got an idea for like a short story or novella, 2 girls go in and one dies and the other one has to transport her body the rest of the way out along the river. And she said, Dad, I don't have any time, why don't you go ahead and write it yourself? So I did. But I've never been up there. So the descriptions are based on, there's a lot of people like this gentleman here that have documented and done photos, and they're all online. And so, I can visit the place without having been there. My daughter's been there, so she can help. My daughter's a paddler, so she helped with all the paddling scenes. And as I wrote about going down the river, I'd call her up and say, what was Grassy Island like? Was Grassy Island grassy? And then, another part of the Barron story is about, it's a love story about 2 women, and my daughter's gay, and so it's a love story about 2 women. And as you can tell that I'm not 20 years old, I'm not female, and I'm not a lesbian. So it helped talking to her a lot about that. So it was one of those books that was a lot of empathy, and I think that was the fun part of the book, is exploring this life that my daughter lived that I didn't know about, and exploring an area that I've never been through my daughter. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that I highly recommend. Like I say, that was one of my favorite novels last year. I like novels that are set up in wilderness areas, of course, because that's what I write about too, but I really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed that story of you and your daughter, well, not your daughter, but the 2 fictional characters.
Right, yes.
And what she had to go through in the ordeal that happens in the Barrens.
Sure.
I'm not going to say any more because you have to.
Okay, I'll open it up to some other questions, but I just wanted to end this part with just a fact, which is Cary's book is #1 in canoeing right now, and it's #5. In natural disaster. The question is, how does it feel to be a #1 best-selling author?
Well, if you get, I think that your initials have to be CJ, and then you get, if you narrow it down enough, we're all bestsellers on Amazon.
Well, #5 in natural disasters. That's a big one.
That's great. That's great. I have to say though, first time I noticed this was before the book came out. It was it was number one in canoeing and new releases. And I clicked on it, and I said, whoa, I wonder what else is out there in canoeing. And I clicked on it, and canoeing must be some Japanese term for, women in really skimpy bathing. Because number 3 and number 4 in that category were like calendars, swimsuit calendars. So I you have to take it with a grain of salt.
Is there any questions out there? Yes?
To follow up on a couple of Kurt's questions, Gunflint Falling in some ways, well, your later book, Gunflint Burning. Did you interview any of the same people for both books? And if so, were the PTS kind of idea, were they doubly traumatized by both events?
I did. I interviewed, like, the guy that comes to mind is Jody Leadholm, who was the air attack supervisor for the air effort in both the Hand Lake fire as well as the search and rescue and recovery afterwards. And those guys, that's what they do. The Forest Service people that I interviewed, that's sort of their shtick. So they talked about dicey moments in the air and things like that, but not too much. But others, like individuals, well, if I think about Vicki Brockman, who's one of the people that's injured in the book that I chronicle, and Lisa Noss, both of those people, I don't think Lisa's ever been back to the Boundary Waters, and and Vicki, I don't think I'm not sure she's been back there either. Although they all said they both said that they would go back. But other people, there was a fair amount of overlap, and again, back to your earlier question, that really helped because I could identify who the professionals were that worked the search and recovery. The pilots, Pat Lowe and Wayne Erickson, they were in both stories too. There was a fair amount of overlap. Yeah.
Are you thinking of a possible revision? Because I have another man you could interview sitting next to me here.
Is that, were you in the blowdown?
I was.
Oh, you were, where?
I was like feet up the end of the South Hill, up the classics.
Oh, yeah, so you were near Lake Polly, yeah. And did you get hit very hard?
Super hard.
Okay. It was kind of funny that the trajectory of the storm was actually, the heart of it was further north than Lake Polly. But there were a lot of side things in that storm that just hit brief spots and then it would go up, and it almost like it was hopping. And it would hit some areas much harder than in others. In fact, if you look at some of the pictures of Polly Lake, their camp looks devastating. But the forest around their camp didn't look too bad. So it was kind of funny that way. Was it that way for you too?
Most of what we went through was matchsticks.
Okay.
Out to be out there, so yeah, it was. Yeah.
Did you get out that
We
first
did.
day?
We did. Yeah, we did. We had cold fish and Lisa Nolan left. It was our last day.
Oh, yeah.
So we were bound and determined. So there were 4 of us and 2 dogs. And yeah, we got back. We left before sunrise. Did the first port. Didn't realize what we were up against. Fort Knox. And
Yeah.
then,
Yeah. Were you able to drive out?
this is like providence from the Lord. Was before we left, the guy I was with went back to his car to get a bottle of rum and moved it to the middle of the parking lot. Sawbill's got a big rectangular parking lot, and he moved it to the middle for some reason. And we got back, and trees were down. The whole parking lot, all the trees were down, and they had cut a width of an ambulance to get up from.
Oh, so yeah. Wow, you were fortunate.
Yeah,
That was,
his car was in the middle of the parking lot.
yeah. And that was the afternoon of the 4th?
Mhm.
Yeah. You were lucky you got out. Yes.
I my life right up in there. Was this a straight line that really localized or couldn't have gone as far as that truck? Because one day on that, you couldn't get off the island because the wind was so strong and then if I'm misremembering.
No, I mean, this storm that hit I'm not sure where Schwamigan Bay.
Oh, Madeline Island, Fossil Island.
Oh, yeah, it probably did hit some of that, yeah. Because it angled east-northeast, it probably caught the southern part of the windstorm, but it angled east-northeast out of the arrowhead into southern Canada, just kept heading in that direction all the way out into the Atlantic Ocean. Took about 24 hours to get there, but yeah, it was bad, and it wouldn't surprise me that you experienced. I think they experienced some in northern Wisconsin.
Paradise Service was closed for an entire day because wind was, but I'm not quite sure if I'm talking the same storm that you all could.
Oh,
It was that summer.
that would not surprise me that you were. Yes.
In your interviews with the paper, you stressed part of the reason for writing these books is to talk about warning people to be safe when they're out in the wilderness. Could you expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, actually, one of the reasons I got interested in writing about these wilderness disasters and stuff is because 1997, I think it was, or maybe a little bit earlier, 1996, I was hiking with a buddy, this is the buddy, hiking with a buddy up off of the, what's the name of that river?
Cascade.
Cascade.
It was a Cascade Death March.
Yes, it was, yeah, we went up one end of Cascade, it was March 28th, it was a beautiful day, and we went up, and we got up off the lake, and the snow was deeper than we expected, and we got lost, and even though, during the summer, it's.
3 young children with us?
Yeah, 3 young children with us, and anyway, it was supposed to be 2.5 hours, about 7 hours later, we tumbled out of the, woods, and so I became really interested in it, and thought, man, if we can get lost, part of my problem was I was following.
But he was making good time.
Yeah. But if we can get lost, a lot of people can get lost up there, and so all of my books have an element of cautionary tale. Lost in the Wild is a story about campers who get different stories that, for one reason or another, get lost in the woods. And it is important to understand that once you get out in the wilderness areas, you kind of step off the grid. It's less and less so as time goes on because of cell phone coverage and better coverage overall, and sat phones and things like that. But still, when you're out, just like what you chronicle in the Barrens, I mean, it is fiction, but that kind of thing we know has happened before.
Yeah, I think when the Widgewagon kids go out now, they have a sat phone and what do they call it, PRB or something like that,
Oh,
personal
yeah.
locator beacon. Yeah,
Yeah, you have that in the book.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it gets broken,
yeah.
so they can't use it. Conveniently. The wonders of fiction.
Don't tell them everything. Yes.
After you wrote Gunflint Burning, did people come forward, like this gentleman did, who you hadn't included in your book, and talk to you and say, hey, I was there? And if that happened often enough with either book, would you consider a new edition or revision or
Well, yeah, a lot of
addendum?
a lot of people would come forward, especially when I do events like up in Grand Marais or Duluth. A lot of people come forward and talk about, hey, I was there, just like this gentleman, I was there, and blue, or you
Right.
you have experiences too, and they're dramatic. They're all really dramatic, but I'm comfortable with the story that I told in Gunflint Burning, and comfortable with the story I told you. Part of it is you gotta it's easier to track if you're only telling a couple stories, a couple dramatic stories. And if you put too many people in it, I had a really dramatic piece I had to cut out of this of a wilderness ranger by the name of John Pierce that I wrote. He went in that morning out of Ely with 2 buddies fishing up into Pipestone Bay, up in Basswood Lake, I think it is. He was right in the middle of the storm, and he had really interesting stories down. I wrote the whole thing up and shared it with him, and he said, yeah, this is good, but at the end, it just kind of didn't fit with the rest, so I met a lot of people like John, and people that have come up to me since then that have told me those stories.
Might you turn those into short stories for publication in a magazine?
Yeah, I will. I mean, I think Minnesota Conservation Volunteer will probably run this John Pierce, a shorter version of it, that story. So yeah, I definitely will repurpose those in blog posts and things like that. Yes.
What's the status of the blowdown area? I mean, are we talking a tinderbox waiting for the next match to light? Or are we talking about DNR or anyone doing a concerted haul out of these tens of thousands
They're not
of
gonna haul
down trees?
They'll do controlled burns, but they can't haul out because it's non-mechanized.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and they, you know, Canada on the north side of Gunflint Lake, that's not Quetico, it's not that, they actually went in and harvested. these
Okay.
nature- Because they could put in a road, and they
Okay.
actually, there was a little road up there anyway. But in the wilderness, it's a wilderness area,
Yep.
no roads,
Yep.
and a lot of people ask
Yep.
this about, why didn't they go in and harvest all these trees? But, you know, a lot of the trees didn't fall down, a lot of the trees were broken off 6 feet up. If they would have suspended the wilderness rules long enough to put in a road, it would have taken so long to get that road in. By the time they would have, 12 months later, by the time they would have gone in, the Forest Service people said the wood wouldn't be suitable for harvesting. And so they
But
just.
what does it mean for now or going
Well,
forward?
now, you know, this is
Yeah.
25 years later,
Right.
we've had a lot of prescribed burns.
Right.
We've had a lot of forest fires.
Right.
Cavity Lake,
Exactly.
yeah. So all those are burned. There's still fuel up there,
Right.
but it's much less than it was.
Huh.
And the forest has really grown up green.
Really?
around it. Yeah, oh yeah, the forest is really.
I haven't been up, so, you
Yeah.
know, but I've got friends in Ely that are, you know, replanting their property because of climate change.
Yeah,
Because I know certain varieties aren't.
and they've done a ton of that at the end of the Gunflint Trail.
Okay, okay.
The non-wilderness. Yes.
So we were on the Spear Hiking Trail during Big Blow, hike from, during the actual storm, we were down inside of Cedar Forest, and I remember lightning was just intense. And then we hiked up to, it went through, and I remember the pressure just taking all of the air out of your lungs. It was shocking. And so we hiked up to Mount Baldy, which is right above Bluefin Bay, pitched a tent, and then we watched the fireworks that night. And that night, 17 inches of rain fell. And we finally made our way to the Temperance River the next day, and you could hear the roar of the Temperance, and the trail was gone. I mean, it was, so we basically hiked crosswise into, trying to find our way to the 61. Did anybody talk about the rain that fell that night?
Yeah, they did, you know, it was funny, you know, the windstorm that hit the people that I talked about and that blew down 48 million trees in the Boundary Waters happened from noon, when did you hit it at Burnside Lake? Was it around noon?
Around noon, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the parade was supposed to start at 1 and they put it off till 2.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was hopping on its way into the western edge of the BWC. Once it hit the western edge, it just flattened everything and went all the way. But one of the weird things about that, it sort of split. And there was a southern angle that came in and went out further south. The bulk of the harvest storm went this east-northeast trajectory. But then later that night, a second storm came through, huge rainfall. There's a Forest Service guy that lives in, at the time now he's retired, he was forest management officer by the name of Tim Norman that told me, I interviewed him and he told me all about that evening. In fact, one of the interesting things he told me was during the parade in Lutsen that day, there was a Tofty?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of those others. his daughter had horses, and they got the horses down, and she wanted to go in the parade, and her girlfriend, and so they went in the parade with the horses, and they could not, even this was before the storm hit, they could not get those horses into the trailer to get them back up there, because the horses were so, they knew something was coming.
Right.
And they ultimately, they ended up getting them in there, but it wasn't very easy. And then that night, that storm came through, and they had to close down 61 for a
Yeah,
little while.
I mean, it almost took out the bridge on the Temperance River.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
we were walking knee deep in water.
yeah, it was it
Wasted.
coming right over 61?
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
yeah, it was, I'd say the water was probably a foot below that bridge on Temperance River.
Yeah, and it also
Most times
washed
it's
out
40 feet.
huge boulders
Right.
onto 61. Tim Norman
Right.
told me at midnight he got called out to close off 61, and a trucker didn't realize they were, that 61 was gonna be closed, and he blew through, right out in front of Bluefin. He blew down 61, and he hit these boulders, and they completely gnarled up the bottom of his truck, and he had to pull it to the side. Yes.
Okay, so I just wanna say Lost in the Wild, so when our son was little and his friends were little, we'd read the book out loud to them. And then we'd say, okay, you tell us where the person went wrong, you know, like, it was such a good book. So it was used for great educational purposes, and I love every book you've written. And, I was wondering, did you talk to any meteorologists about the phenomenon of this thing and how it traveled and how it looked back to the south, like, or no?
Yeah, I did. In fact, that's how I knew it did. In the book, there's, I interviewed Mike Stewart, was the head of the National Weather Service Duluth office at the time. And I interviewed him, and, he told me stories about it. And then I read a lot of reports, but it wasn't until, some of these meteorological reports that came out by academics about the whole phenomena. Most of the stuff I was reading was localized in the boundary waters, but some of them told about the entire storm going out there, and some Forest Service stuff. But man, you read some of those texts, and I can't understand what's going on. And I actually asked Peter Leshak, who's a guy up north. He works for the Forest Service. He writes books. He's an excellent author. He actually worked on the blowdown, and he completely understood and explained what happened to me. And I put it in the book, but I couldn't tell you right off how it happened. But it was pretty incredible the way Peter explained it to me, what actually happened. It was very unusual, especially at that latitude. There was just a real confluence of weird events that happened. I mean, one of them was that summer had been really wet, so the soil was really wet, the leaves were saturated, there was a lot of humidity in the air, and so when they were hit by those strong winds, they didn't have a really good grip. If they'd been drier, a lot more trees might have survived.
Do you record all these interviews, or do you take notes?
Yeah, I record them. First I ask if it's okay if I record them.
Right.
I record them, then I transcribe them, because I like to listen to them again, because I know then I'm gonna pull out what's interesting, and what quotes are important. And then I write them up in
So how long did this book take you to write?
20 years. No. It took about 4 years, but I was writing fiction at the time too, so it's not.
How does that work? I mean, I can only think about one thing at a time.
Well, a lot of time was in between these interviews, right? So
Okay.
you'd reach out to somebody, yeah, I can meet with you next month, and you'd go back to your other project. You must have several projects.
I finish a book and I move on to the next. But yes,
I do that with the novels, right? With the nonfiction, because of you've gotta talk to a lot of people and do a lot of research and.
So is there another nonfiction book you're already taking notes on?
Well, I'd like to make this a trilogy, have it Gunflint Rising, about the recovery of the forest and rebuilding and the decision to rebuild. And, a lot of people in the Ham Lake fire just said, no thanks, I'm not, after the Ham Lake fire, in fact, in Grand Marais, there's an art gallery up there. Sievertson's thing. Jan's place
She
burned down.
wasn't gonna do it, now she did.
Exactly, she took 2 years. And a lot of them, they look at it after the fire went down, and my wife Anna and I were there like 10 days after the fire burned down. And I felt so awful for those people. I thought, this is never gonna be the same. You probably saw that in the burned areas too.
Yeah, I saw a lot of the burned areas. They were more east of where I was,
Yeah,
but we certainly saw them.
but I think it's an interesting story, who decides to rebuild and why. And Jan is one example. She waited 2 years and she started to fall
Well, the
in.
pain was intense, and it belonged in the family for a long time.
Oh.
A lot of intense pain when they lost.
Yeah, but she came to love the new way that the place looked. First of all, it exposed a lot of that pink bedrock, and she really liked the way that looked. But so another one, and I'm really interested in this wolf controversy. I want to write a nonfiction book about that as well.
Get a lot of opinions.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, you will.
Yeah,
You will.
lots of things.
Yeah.
All right, well, I have never wanted to go canoeing less in my life. All right, thank you guys so much. That was terrific. And now we're going to have the authors go over to the signing table where they will be pleased to answer further questions or accept more accolades and buy a book. Thank you all again for coming.
Good to see you, Anna. Must be fun to attend all these events.